Hey, it's Soul, and as always, it is good to see you, or to see you, right? Welcome back for another sit down with a fellow armchair developer. Today, I want to talk about encounter design and raid balance, which is, one of the drier topics that I've talked about, and also not something that everyone is interested in. However, raiding is a big part of World of Warcraft, whether you're on the front lines as a world-first raider, if you're a middle-of-the-road sort of player, or if someone who sees one of these raids and you're like, wow, that's cool. It's going to be great when I see it like a few years from now when I solo it. So I personally come from the perspective of someone who runs a heroic raiding guild, who's still 2 bosses away from clearing the whole darn thing for this season. This latest round of hotfixes in the Shadowlands, Season 3 to be precise, is like the umpteenth underline to draw under this raid, the Sepulcher of the First One's raid, as a raid that has been generally just really difficult, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. However, its difficulty has, at least anecdotally and from observation, felt like it's been a series of one wall after another for more players than it should have been. It was overtuned, I guess, is what I'm suggesting here. It was overtuned to a point where it needed so many nerfs that for those very few players who managed to clear it early on, if they look back, the raid almost looks unrecognizable, as if it was knocked down from Mythic to Heroic almost. And here's what I mean, and to help, I'm going to throw some stuff on screen. We're going to use the Anduin encounter as an example. These nerfs didn't happen all at once, but they occurred over the past few months, beginning in March, and in the full context, it tells a story of how players were faring. For simplicity's sake, though, I'm just going to show you the total number of nerfs from this one boss. So as you can see, he's had several health nerfs from the boss itself and also to the ads. There were some throughput changes to make the fight a little bit more manageable, more forgiving. Less healing required for the barrier thing, which was nerfed twice actually. Less unavoidable damage going out, but also less damage from abilities that you could avoid. And being the encounter it is, lots of mechanical changes to make the fight less frustrating. Ads aren't affected by the wicked stars when they first spawn. The exploding thing the big ad does in the down phase, it has a slower cast time. The circle debuffs, I call it the kiss mechanic. It's much more forgiving with a longer duration, and it's not going to hit the group that returned from the down phase. There's lots of stuff here, and it's just a fraction of the dozens of nerfs done between all the bosses across every difficulty. And so today we're going to talk about what's the problem with this situation, and can this be avoided or mitigated in the future? So we'll just get right to it. What is the problem? I mean, top guilds were able to clear it in a few weeks with some nerfs, I should add, but they got it. So how about, getting good or practice or swapping people out and having a better comp or figuring out a better strategy? Obviously, those are very facetious and misleading responses. In hindsight, it's easy to see that the raid tuning was set to be almost designed for those few hundred people who make up the top 50 or so guilds in the world, out of the thousands and thousands of other guilds who participate in raiding at, any difficulty level. But I also think that that difficulty is kind of okay. It could have totally been fine that this raid, especially the Mythic version, turned out to be exceptionally hard. But the way that World of Warcraft is fundamentally built, the WoW team feels compelled to make the raid clearable for those who want to clear it now, because later it's going to be different. The problems that they made for themselves, the WoW team, are multifaceted, some more important than others, but I'm just going to go over a few of them. First, there was the unlocking of features during this patch, notably double legendaries. In hindsight, having to wait a few weeks for the story to unlock double legendaries, it didn't quite catapult teams towards face rolling the raid. However, that was something that top players feared, and they preemptively blamed the WoW team for mishandling such a powerful feature. As it turned out, though, the unlocking of double legendaries and the availability of the creation catalyst later to make tier gear, it didn't turn the raid into a loot pinata, like some, like myself, had expected it would. So the WoW team gets a ding for it anyway. Like the big power gains, they didn't make a big enough difference to be effective, even if they were made available from the start of that season. Next come the so-called dependence on add-ons, especially on Mythic difficulty, when many players relied on the likes of weak auras to manage assignments and placement and more. Now personally, I think on heroic difficulty, it's not nearly as big of a deal. I think like timers do the job just fine. But when I talk about the dependence of add-ons, I'm talking about the reason for this dependence, and by that I mean the complexity of all these different fight mechanics, the dance that players have to commit to on top of committing to their throughput. Notice the mechanical nerfs to fights like Anduin that actually lessen the need for an add-on or a weak aura to manage it, while the HP and damage nerfs do make the fight more forgiving, but the slow acquisition of gear has always been playing a part with making encounters easier over time. The WoW team made a problem for itself by creating too many mechanics that just couldn't be overcome with simply having higher DPS or health pools. That's why we've been seeing over the past few months a lot of mechanical nerfs. So from these nerfs, what is the WoW team trying to do here? It seems clear to me that internally the team is trying to hit some sort of target, that this many people in a dataset should be able to clear the raid at certain difficulties over a period of time. The Warcraft way of doing it involves a number of tools, such as, like what we were talking about, targeted nerfs to things that their data sees as like obstacles or walls for players. And if the WoW team helps to chip at that wall, they can just watch the players knock the rest down and then move on to the next boss. From the looks of it, they've identified that players' problems have been more about mechanics than throughput. The problem that they've again made for themselves here, though, is that this is the only tool in their arsenal. That's it. During the final raids of numerous expansions, including the Warlords and Legion and Battle for Azeroth expansions, there existed some sort of soft nerf to the instance or the contents that slowly trivialized the difficulty in the face of overwhelming throughput. Warlords had the Sanctum Ring, Legion had the Concordance of Legionfall, plus the artifact weapon and levels and the upgradable Titanforge trinket, and of course Titanforge gear as well. Battle for Azeroth didn't have Titanforge in at the end, but it was there as a soft nerf throughout earlier seasons. And then Corruption took up the mantle as the thing that eventually broke raids and other encounters. All throughout here were also nerfs to problematic raid mechanics too. The point is they had more built-in features to sort of soft nerf the instance in a predictable way, as if they, planned it. Throughout Shadowlands raids, the nerfs have been almost 100% reactionary. Between gear without Titan forging and I guess conduits, woo-woo, there wasn't a whole lot to help players feel a tiny bit stronger from one week to the next. If we were to break down Season 3 content, we're looking at item level with the usual paths, including crafted gear, running Myth Plus, and so on. There was the milestone that unleashed double legendaries, another milestone that gave more accessibility to tier set bonuses, and curiously enough, hitting the conduit cap required either completing a plus 20 keystone on time or clearing the Sepulcher raid on Mythic, which is what's the point? Even then, realistically, I don't think that making 278 conduits more accessible early on, I don't think it would have made a difference. And that was it. That was all the ammo that the WoW team had before moving to these targeted fixes, and they've been using it as a crutch ever since. And in other conversations I've been reading, some have said that the nerfs should not have been done at all, that Mythic is Mythic for a reason, and it should stand as a monument to one of WoW's most difficult raids ever. Others have tried to make a game versus game thing out of it, and I definitely prefer that it doesn't become a thing here in the comments, please. World of Warcraft, it does its thing. I think it best to talk about how WoW can do it better, rather than, oh, WoW should change fundamentally to satisfy trying to be like some other game for the sake of the tiny elite population. But what can be done? How can this sort of situation be avoided, or at least mitigated a little bit? I have 3 ideas to talk about, but they're not the only 3, and they're definitely not the best ideas. I'm just dropping my 2 cents from my own perspective. So the first idea is to kind of sort of shift encounter design. I'm super oversimplifying here, but I see an encounter design to be unequally 1 part throughput and 1 part mechanical. I think there's a bit too much emphasis on the mechanic side of encounters to where players rely on add-ons like weak auras and DBM and whatnot to handle these numerous overlapping things that are happening on their screen. Some of the nerfs throughout the season were made to basically negate the need for a weak aura to manage it, but we're still doing some work. There's still some danger, there's still something to obey. Now, I'm a staunch believer that weak auras are not needed, and as a reminder, I'm only a heroic raider, but for Mythic, weak auras do save on a ton of possible pulls that would be used to get people used to the coordination needed without them. So I guess the question that the encounter teams ought to ask themselves is if XYZ mechanic would benefit almost too much from having a weak aura, and if so, maybe that mechanic should be simplified or redesigned in such a way that it still feels impactful, but it doesn't require an add-on to manage it. I think others have said that the team shouldn't make encounters assuming that players will be using weak auras too, which I guess is the same thing. Next idea is to reintroduce soft nerfs, and this can be done in a couple of ways. One is the Hellscream Warsong route. Back in the day, Wrath of the Lich King to be precise, a few raids were given an aura that would nerf the entire raid, or they would buff players. Now, of course, they were very simple and throughput related, so players could just power through and eat mechanics or kill bosses so dead that some mechanics could be avoided entirely. Of course, that came from the more simplistic encounters of that day. Now, these auras, they got stronger over time, and players could plan around these and even turn them off if they felt like it. Another way to soft nerf would be adding character-specific progression, so by this I'm talking about what I talked about earlier, the Sanctum Ring, Artifact Power, the Concordance of Legion Fall, basically borrowed power. However, that applied everywhere, not just in the raid. A raid-specific example of borrowed power would be the Shards of Domination, which honestly I did like as a thing that made encounters easier over time, but it had its own problems, which makes me kind of glad that it's gone. With more thought though, I think that the WoW team could be onto something. And neither of these ideas are mutually exclusive. Like, please do both if that works. And on top of that, please do the targeted nerfs as usual. By being more proactive with more thoughtful design and predictable power gains for all players, it helps to kind of sand down those rough edges of encounter design. Let's pretend that here there was some buff related to pumping cosmic flux into your little Pokepoke creature, and you got like this Poco proc that gave some raid buff that got stronger over time. Now, if that was there from the start of this season, we would still definitely see raid nerfs, but probably not at the level of discourse that we're seeing today. Now, the last idea that I have is pretty extreme, but hear me out. Right now, we have Mythic raids, and with that, we have Mythic item level. Now, Mythic raids aren't the only endgame in town. There's organized PvP, there's Mythic keystones, and together, this makes up the big three. So what I propose is that we take out the Mythic item level and effectively cap player power at what would be heroic raids, with PvP and dungeons following the same pattern. This is kind of wild, I know, and here's what this would mean for a raider type of person. They would clear heroic and they would get some or a lot of heroic gear. Cool. Mythic raids will still be 20-man locked, and they are going to have harder encounters somehow, but they're going to be tuned around the heroic item level cap, and it's still going to award the same gear as heroic. Maybe it'll have a shared lockout, I don't know, not important. But maybe by clearing all the bosses on Mythic difficulty, you get some sort of snazzy achievement and you unlock the Mythic appearance of that season's gear or some sort of equivalent to that. And here's how players are likely to react to that sort of news. Outrage. They'd be straight up mad, and for good reason. Let's assume that any player does Mythic raiding because they want the Mythic appearance, or they want the prestige of having completed the toughest content in the game. Everyone's got different priorities, whatever. A while back when Mythic Keystones really started taking off, people asked out loud, what's the point of Mythic raiding if I can get best in slot pieces from Mythic Plus instead? And that's a great question. Some folks were in a sort of crisis of priorities, and among them, some were like, all right, screw Mythic raiding, I'm just gonna push keys. And I'd like to think that after a few expansions, we now have this more mature Mythic Plus community built from absolutely great players who may or may not raid Mythic stuff for whatever reason that they have. There's still plenty of crossover between these two camps, I imagine, and presently we're kind of used to having Mythic-like gear, even if we've only cleared a few Mythic-like raid bosses. It begs the question, Does Mythic raiding need to award gear the way that it does, or can it just be harder, with the reward being the transmog and the prestige of having done it? I think we're kind of sort of there already, and the gearing up process from heroic to Mythic raids is just little more than a time-consuming step for people who don't run Mythic keys. The real question to ask is, well, why go this route? I thought we were talking about trying to do something about raid tuning, right? And here's my angle. I'd argue that it's easier to tune these kinds of Mythic raids when the item level cap is lower, and the encounter team can assume that a raid's average item level isn't going to go up by all that much, or at all actually. This is going to mean that encounters will seem to be mechanically more complex because there isn't a lot of wiggle room for throughput, but as I mentioned, thanks to Mythic Plus, we're already sort of there. I think the team just has to review what they think is complex raid design minus the dependence on add-ons. All in all, gearing across the board I think is going to be faster. And to respond to walls that players encounter, of course hotfixes will be in play. No one's asking for an end to hotfixes, right? But I think being proactive, like having a scaling aura on players or mobs, would be a big help too. And that's all I've got for now. The conversations over raid tuning and encounter design have been very interesting. I've been seeing them all over social media, and I thought I'd share my perspective on the topic. But now it's your turn. What are your thoughts on how overtuned this raid was? Or was it not overtuned and players just need to get good? I hope to hear from you, and if you don't mind, like the video, subscribe for more content, hit the bell too, so you know when I come out with new stuff, and I'll catch you later. Until then, stay safe, stay healthy, and stay breezy.